Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Ryan Bijan, host of Cowtown Movie Classics, and welcome to our inaugural film of our Monster Monday series in October. And normally, I love the classic Gothic horror films of the 30s, 40s, the classic Hammer films. You know, I'm a huge fan of that. But I thought it'd be kind of fun to cleanse the palate a little bit and kick it off with one of my favorite contemporary horror films of the last 30 or 40 years. So tonight we are going to be showing director and writer William Peter Blatty's The Exorcist III, based on his novel Legion. Joining me tonight is returning friend of Cowtown Movie Classics and film historian, Mr. Dan Marino. How are you doing tonight, Dan?
I'm doing good, Ryan. How are you doing tonight?
All right, it's interesting. So the last film we had you on about a week ago was Faust, and tonight's movie, it's about a very different type of deal with the devil.
That's exactly right. It is indeed a very different relationship with the devil. You could almost say it has, the devil. It's a little bit more, almost from the devil's perspective. No, it's
Yeah, yeah.
certainly almost a character study in the devil, if that is a better way of phrasing it.
Well, what's fascinating about this film, and we mentioned the title of the film is The Exorcist III. So I think, unfortunately, that gives a lot of people a lot of preconceived notions going in. Okay, it's a shameless cash grab. It's Friday the 13th Part 3, it's Scream 7, it's Halloween 12. You know what I mean? Which I think there is something inherently cynical about making a sequel to any film, especially a film as highly regarded as the original Exorcist.
You're 100% correct, and we certainly have the same view on that particular matter. As I've always said, the minute you do any type of sequel, the odds are probably against you because you are trying to capture lightning in a bottle twice. Of course, however, we do, have quite a few of them, and there is a lot to be said about people that have navigated that successfully, less successfully. You bring up an excellent point, and it's something you've mentioned to me off camera before, that to call this film The Exorcist 3 is in some ways one of the things you could maybe hold most against it if you were to hold something against it, because it sort of gives what might be a false expectation, which we can maybe clear up here a little. The movie is based on the sequel to The Exorcist, written by William Peter Blatty. However, that was called Legion.
Mhm.
And it was probably done for exactly the reason you're saying. He was trying to call it Legion, that even though it was a sequel, give it a little bit of a different expectation about what you were about to see. And indeed, this film feels like something, as Blatty himself was, a little bit more in the serious Catholic literary tradition of some of the great Catholic writers of the 20th century, like Graham Greene, George Bernanos, Shisaku Endo, Evelyn Waugh, Flannery O'Connor, Walker Percy. Blatty is very much entrenched in that tradition. And of course, we think of him as a horror figure because The Exorcist itself is such a horrific novel. But it was viewed, in very serious literary terms by those figures as well, I think. And this is actually similar to that, and like something any of those people would have written, a sort of more of a chamber drama exploring many of the deep, issues and philosophical problems surrounding evil, the nature of reality, the devil himself, sin, all of the above, how we contend with that in a very serious fashion, and to where some of the genre trappings almost feel a little inconveniently wedged in, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, because it does walk a fine line. You have a film that, on one hand, it is very much a true crime police procedural thriller, but then it takes obviously a supernatural turn. If it didn't, it wouldn't be The Exorcist, right? So it kind of goes off in a very
Yeah,
interesting direction from what the expectations might be. But I'm
you're
no, sorry.
Oh, I did not mean to cut you off, but what I
Yeah.
was simply going to say is just in keeping with the sequel tradition and all of that, your audience is in for something, that is very unique in that way because, it is certainly not anything common or typical within the typical horror genre to have a third film in the series be something like this, or anything even approaching it. It's kind of its own thing, and as we said, it's a little bit unfortunate that we almost wedge it into the box of calling it The Exorcist 3.
Yeah, but returning to the point of William Peter Blatty, this is a fascinating film in the sense that I can only think of a handful of examples off the top of my head, but this is one of the few times I can think of in a major Hollywood studio film where you have the novelist, you have the author of the original novel coming in and not only writing, but directing the adaptation of his own work. The only other example I can think of right off the top of my head is probably Clive Barker with Hellraiser.
You're absolutely correct. I mean, he is one of the very few authors who successfully bridge that kind of gap from the literary tradition into film. And part of the reason for that, and I think we think of him more as an author because of the success of The Exorcist, and he certainly had quite a life before he even got into writing literature. Was in the military, got his master's in English literature before that, all of that. But he actually had a very strong background in screenwriting. He wrote many comedies with Blake Edwards leading up to this, which is very odd when you think about contextualizing that with this now. But he had written many films, and indeed he was one of the producers of the original Exorcist. So he was very collaborative with Friedkin in a way that many authors are not. And even in this case, Friedkin, I think up till a point, was very interested in potentially doing this version. But ultimately, Blatty settled on doing it himself and does a very, adept job of directing it.
Yeah, I'd go even further than that. What's fascinating is like you might kind of go in with the understanding, okay, it's a writer, he's a novelist, a screenwriter, he's adapting his own script. The main rule of filmmaking is you always want to show and not tell. Does the movie suffer from a little bit of that? I don't necessarily think so, but it does kind of fall into the opposite direction in that regard. But I don't want our audience to underestimate Blatty's skill as a director. I think this is a beautifully made film, and there's such a palpable sense of dread that he's able to convey that's not present in a lot of horror films even now.
I think that's absolutely true. And as I said, you have something that feels a little bit more almost in the sort of spiritual art house tradition of, like I said, that Catholic literary history. Some of the Russian spiritual filmmakers come to mind, like Tarkovsky and Sokurov and things like that. Certainly, as I said, wedged much more firmly in a sort of genre tradition than those films. But we have sequences in this film that oscillate between art house, religiosity, pondering things like that. Certainly dialogue like that, and what dialogue like that could be better spoken than some of the great actors we have in this film, like George C. Scott, who is replacing Lee J. Cobb, another great actor from the original, who died shortly after, replacing him in the role of Kinderman. Brad Dourif gives some of his best work, I think, in his early.
Incredible in this film.
He's great in the film. There's lots of great performances, and it oscillates between that, and then you also have some very legitimately horrifying and intense jump scares, existential scares. I mean, you have quite a lot under the heading of one film in this film, and yeah, it's certainly very much a unique treat for your audience.
Oh yeah, I'm certainly looking forward to seeing it on the big screen, especially with that amazing sound system. The sound design in this movie is insane. It's incredible. You're definitely going to be swept into the world that Blatty has created. I'm glad you brought up that in the previous film, so the protagonist of this movie, it is Detective Kinderman, who in the original Exorcist is played so wonderfully by the magnificent Lee J. Cobb. He's almost the comic relief of that film. He's a very lovable character in that original film. But then you also have the returning character of Father Dyer, who in the original Exorcist was played by the real life priest, Father William O'Malley. So this is just to set up the film for our audience who may be familiar with that original Exorcist film, but they might not remember the character names or see the connective tissue because both of those roles were recast.
I would completely agree, and I think you're right. He sort of is almost the relief in The Exorcist, the original, because we go so far down a rabbit hole with all of those characters dealing with the possession. He is sort of, in a sense, the only, our only sort of window to the outside world looking in. He's kind of our relief from that, kind of rabbit hole, so to speak. And ironically, in this film, it's him going down his own rabbit hole, really, and his own metaphysical conundrums that are associated with all of the things that go into being a police officer, really. And that's interesting, and that's where the procedural element of this really comes into it. Certainly something we probably should bring up as well is the associations with the Zodiac killer, which is something that it lends itself more readily to a procedural because there is the gruesome nature of the murders and the crimes that take place here, and it is not an atypical character to have that sort of noir styled cop, world weary of dealing with the sort of day to day, the banality of evil, as it's called. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And indeed, even a recent film, not to bring it too far out of this, that I just saw, which was The Haunting of Venice, which with
Oh
Kenneth
yeah.
Branagh. The Hercule Poirot character experiences even in that. It's a very traditional kind of character where we find the police officer musing on the nature of morality, the nature of sin in the universe, how they contend with it. And what's fascinating is that this particular film takes what you could call a trope and expands so thoroughly upon it with the all of these metaphysical sequences and preconceptions and ideas associated with Satan himself. And again, this is almost a character study of Satan himself, if you could call it that.
I
Yeah.
definitely like that approach. Well, Dan, thank you so much. If you're in the audience, please stick around after the credits so you can hear the rest of our conversation. During the credits, if you want to get up, go to the restroom, grab a drink, come back around, and you can hear the rest of our conversation. I know Dan has an amazing quote. What were you going to say? Sorry.
Well, I did want to share that you just led into me very well, Ryan, because I found that while this is not any spoilers associated with it,
Sure.
but in the book Legion, it would be fair to describe it as an ending passage. And I thought to myself after reading it, it would be very apt for your audience to know it, and it kind of gives a nice panorama of what they're about to see. But in the end of the film, as I said, it's a bit of a character study almost of Lucifer himself, and it ends with the characters, or sort of in a diner alone, concluding that they believe that the Big Bang was Lucifer falling from heaven, and that the entire universe, including humanity, are broken parts of Lucifer, and that evolution is the process of Lucifer putting himself back together as an angel.
Oh wow, that's an incredible quote. So thank you
Yeah.
so much, Dan. We'll see you after the show. Without further ado, from 1990, written and directed by William Peter Blatty, The Exorcist III: Legion. Wow, that's definitely quite the experience.
Yes, indeed. Certainly, it's quite a ride. As I said, so much in there, so much to consider. It's a little bit overwhelming at times, and indeed, it could be argued perhaps does it exactly neatly fit maybe into a package for some, but it undoubtedly you are containing what is such a grandiose vision of the cosmos and sin and Satan and God and the devil that
Yeah.
it might be hard to fit all of that into the brief time span of the film.
Yeah, well, it's such a brilliantly crafted film that it might become to a surprise to some of our audience members that a lot of this movie was completed in post-production. A lot of the more iconic scenes, the more memorable scenes, William Peter Blatty went head to head with the studio because he was promised he would get to do a straight adaptation of his novel Legion. The studio wanted to cash in on the Exorcist brand, and how could you have an Exorcist film without an actual exorcism?
Right, and and that is in a strange way, depending on one's perspective of the different versions. And as you point out, there are multiple versions of this film. Um, And indeed, the book itself is even different from William Peter Blatty's director's cut, which is Legion. However, it was in this case the studio that pushed for reshoots to say we need an actual exorcism in this because it is The Exorcist. Indeed, it is The Exorcist III, as we said, and we can't have this without some kind of exorcism. You'd have to compare the versions, and we don't have access to all the footage. And indeed, certain things were never shot, according to William Peter Blatty, as I understand it. However, whether or not it conveniently fits in or doesn't conveniently fit in, the Exorcist sequence at the end of this piece is undoubtedly something that will live in your memory for as long as you remember movies or any type of horror movie. I mean, it's a startling and alarming kind of exorcism sequence.
Yeah, it's something we haven't really been seen before on that level, even in the original film. But I think it's definitely, certainly a climactic high point. So for years, as a fan, everyone wanted to see Blatty's original director's cut, which it is available on Blu-ray from Shout Factory. It's been cobbled together with outtakes and VHS dupe footage, and it's definitely a fascinating experience. But it's almost kind of disappointing because in a lot of ways you want to admit that okay, maybe the as far as the cinematic spectacle goes, maybe the studio wasn't wrong with their request. To go back to your point earlier, how amazing is Brad Dourif in this film?
He's fantastic. He is really, I mean, it's funny, Brad Dourif is one of the great character actors, and I find myself every time I watch him in a movie and he's good, the first thing I thought is like, oh, of course Brad Dourif had to play that. I mean, and that
Yeah,
really is the sign of good casting, good directing, but also, of a singular voice in acting, because when you see him in this, you're just sort of like, of course it has to be him, and he really gives, what if this was perhaps again not The Exorcist III, quote unquote, a
yeah,
sequel within that genre. This was something that had a bit more prestigious packaging or something like that. You have something that might, I think is arguably Oscar caliber, or at least awards worthy caliber, to say the least, because he is extremely compelling in this film.
yeah. He's amazing. I remember as a kid, this was probably the first film where I saw Brad Dourif as himself, and he's not voicing a killer doll.
There you go. Yeah, yeah,
But there's
yeah.
definitely, yeah. Sorry, I was gonna say there's definitely a little bit of Charles Lee Ray in the Gemini Killer, or James Veneman as he is in this film.
Well, as you bring up, and I think you pointed out, they recently did the Netflix series Dahmer,
Yeah,
and the obsession with, and again, not the book or anything else, but this particular film was an obsession of Jeffrey Dahmer's, and one of his favorite films. And as eerie as that might sound, I think it's in no small part due to Brad Dourif's performance, has it, because as I said, it's almost a character study of evil and the devil, and this and possession, because what is this serial killer figure here if not a sort of, if in the movie and in the book, a literal manifestation of a demon, but
yeah,
in reality, what could be a better expression of being possessed by a demon than someone like the Zodiac Killer or a Jeffrey Dahmer? And so it's almost just as easily a character study of people like them in some ways.
which is actually kind of bleak when you think about it. Dan, are you single-handedly blaming the actor Brad Dourif for Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes?
Well, I don't want to point any fingers,
Yeah,
but no, I mean, it goes back to that age-old adage. Your job as an artist is to kind of get at truth, and indeed, I would say, probably that very series we're talking about, Jeffrey Dahmer's Netflix, that series was, I think very good, but perhaps very difficult for many people to watch,
yeah, of
not
course.
because any of the actors or the writing was not good. I think perhaps it just had a little bit too much fidelity to the truth, and perhaps Brad Dourif is guilty of that in this performance as well.
Yeah. And I think that's what makes this film so effective, The Exorcist III, is because a lot of when I was a kid growing up, a lot of the other horror films, like, Freddy and Jason aren't real, Dracula's a fictional vampire. It's not, this has no basis in reality. But, there are real life monsters out there committing atrocities on a regular basis. And when I was a kid, I was raised Catholic. So when I saw that first Exorcist movie, like I said, Michael Myers, these other guys aren't real, but you are taught to believe there is a Satan, there is a darker presence out there in the universe. And that's what makes it so effective.
And I think that you bring up a great way into another really cogent point about taking this in, which is that the Catholic Church itself, and I was raised Catholic as well. This is something that's an institution that's undergone and it's been around. The joke I constantly make about the Catholic Church is I'm like, that it's obviously going to have some flaws in there. It's had a front office since 1000 AD. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? So you're going to have some good policies, some bad policies, certainly many that are more than just bad policies, obviously. But it's been an institution that's been around for a very long time. But so it's easy to forget, I think, the landscape historically that figures like William Peter Blatty, are my grandparents, probably yours as well, Martin Scorsese, Graham Greene. Many of these figures grew up in a world where the Catholic Church was something very different than it was before Vatican II and Pope John Paul. It was not the institution today that was mired with the scandal and rife with some of the corruption you could argue that it suffers from today. It was a very respected institution really up until the early 60s. Socially, and Catholicism was taken very, very seriously by those practitioners. And so, the world that Peter Blatty grew up in, that Scorsese grew up in, it's embodied quite a bit in Scorsese's films, like Mean Streets. You don't make up for your sin in the church; you make up for your sins on the streets. The reality of sin, redemption, dealing with the devil was a very real, everyday reality in the religious world that they were brought up in. And I think the vividness of that with successive generations and people's lapsed religiosity largely at the whole. Many people today, I think, are very agnostic. We believe in many different things, but our society is not built around religion in the way that it used to be. But authors like Blatty and Scorsese and many of the other Catholic authors I mentioned grew up in a world like that. And the reality of the devil being a very real, everyday thing that is a thing you contend with on a daily basis was extremely vivid. And The Exorcist is one of, probably famous for really embodying that feeling amongst people who were Catholic raised in that era so vividly, and that's why that has the staying power that it has.
Oh, absolutely. Do you have any other closing thoughts on The Exorcist III?
Well, I mean, specifically, I hope that the audience really enjoyed and got a great deal from it. I often feel it's a little bit of a non sequitur, but I remember Arthur Miller was talking about the works of Yukio Mishima, and he said that he doesn't write novels so much as he writes compressed visions, and in that way, they're perhaps not the best novels, but there's something absurdly compelling about them because there's almost like you're trying to inarticulately compress a vision into the small confines of a story and reality itself. Certainly, William Peter Blatty's novel Legion and the film The Exorcist III, whatever one can say about it, certainly feels like a terrifying and vivid and compressed vision. That it is. I hope everyone really enjoyed it, took something out of. And the last thing I'll say about it too, if you were a fan of this and The Exorcist, I'd urge you to take a look at William Peter Blatty's other great directed film, The Ninth Configuration, which is actually very similar to The Exorcist III in a lot of ways, and they could be viewed as a bit of a trilogy, you could argue.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I'll definitely check that out. Again, Mr. Dan Marino, thank you so much for your time.
You're very welcome, Ryan. A pleasure as always.
All right, I guess we're gonna have you back soon so we can do The Exorcist II, The Heretic, right? We have
Right, exactly. Or something with the devil,
something with
The
the
devil,
devil.
the devil and Daniel Webster, the devil's advocate. We'll find there's quite a few, so I'm sure we'll find one.
There's a lot of great stuff out there. I just wanted to tell our audience that if you are a fan of the Exorcist series, please join us this Friday at 8 p.m. We will be doing our special tribute to the director William Friedkin, who recently passed away, with our other friend of Cowtown Movie Classics, David Del Val. So that's going to be a lot of fun. Once again, my name is Ryan Bijan. We'll see you next time.